This is Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
Plagiarism is not the problem.
The pulpit, the preaching of the Word of God to the congregation is really of the single most greatest importance in the life of the church.
This is Wretched Radio. Unless you've been entirely unplugged from the internet, you have heard the story, even reported by Newsweek magazine, of a brewing scandal in evangelical Christianity, specifically in the Southern Baptist Convention. The current president of the SBC is being accused of plagiarism from the past president of the SBC. Ed Litton's the new president. J.D. Greer is the exiting president of the SBC, and courtesy of some sleuthing by some people who decided, well, let's go visit the website of the church of the new SBC president. And they started to listen to his sermon series on Romans and recognized this sounds a lot like J.D. Greer preaching.
We'll give you a warning here that this might be the toughest week that we will have in the book of Romans. Romans 1, the end of it, is tied in difficulty only with Romans 5, Romans 9, and Romans 11.
This may be one of the toughest passages we face in the book of Romans. This is the steep climb I talked about.
So in fact, let's just sort of loosen things up right now. Everybody turn right now to your neighbor, look them in the eyes. If you know them, put your hand on their shoulder and say, this is going to be a really tough week for you, okay? And tell them, say, I'm praying for you to have the faith and humility to receive this word.
I want you to turn to your neighbor right now. And I want you to say, I know this sermon is going to be really tough for you, but I'm here praying that you will listen and obey whatever God says. Go ahead, do that right now.
This goes on for a lengthy amount of time, a compare and contrast between J.D. Greer and Ed Litton. Most people concluding that sure looks an awful lot like plagiarism. If you would like an exploration of the contents of those sermons and a critique of the contents of those sermons, I would commend to you Justin Peters at justinpeters.org. I would like to examine why this is happening. And this should be known out of the gate is not a one-off. There is a massive trend in evangelical Christianity to buy sermons on the internet. I don't know how many years ago we talked about this subject when it was first in. It could have been 20 years ago when we were doing radio from the cinder block bunker in the middle of a field in St. Paul, Minnesota. People started promoting their sermons. You can buy them online. Rick Warren was one of the first to sell his materials, but now there are entire websites with thousands of sermons for sale that pastors increasingly are utilizing and presenting as their own, which is really, it's staggering that this story already of Ed Litton, J.D. Greer, hasn't resolved itself this quickly is frankly quite amazing. How many, Jimmy, you're a big fan of Mark Driscoll, if I recall.
Huge.
Yeah. And he was, among other things, he was accused of plagiarism.
Yes.
From his book, which, in my estimation, I remember reading that. Yeah, there was some stuff there, and he did not give attribution the way that he should have. That caused the demise of his ministry. Today, people don't seem all that concerned or troubled that the current SBC president was plagiarizing the former SBC president. It is. Some people are calling it community theology. They're doing it as a group. What's wrong with that? That is a good question. What is wrong with that? I believe the root of the plagiarism scandal is a low view of pastoral ministry. This is almost certainly the correct prognosis of the problem. Plagiarism is the fruit. The root is thinking this is okay. Why do you think it's okay? Because you have a very low understanding of what pulpit ministry is all about. That is why we know that thousands of pastors have no compunction about preaching somebody else's words as if they're their own. And by the way, even inserting themselves into anecdotes. I went to one of the websites And what they encourage you to do is change the details just enough, to make it kind of honest, but utilize what we read, what we write for you. So I printed out one of these sermons. This is a sermon on possessing a lion-hearted righteousness. Today we begin a new short series. I'm reading this, so this is going to be some pastor preaching another pastor's sermon. Today we begin a new short series entitled Fearless, possessing a lion-hearted righteousness. This is a series designed to give you a cup of courage. This is a series for people whose courage bank has sprung a leak. I've been asking some of you where you need courage. Zane needs courage to live for his lost mother, who was recently diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Johnny needs courage for his caring of his wife, who is dying with dementia. Okay, so I guess you can use Zane and Diana or whoever it was and just preach it as if it's your own, or just swap out something that's a little bit more personal for you. It turns out pastors are actually inserting themselves into anecdotes. I did this on a trip when it was actually the guy who wrote the sermon who did that on a trip. That's just flabbergasting to me, and yet it is given a pass by so many today because I believe that they too suffer from a very low understanding of pulpit ministry. Steve Lawson, who has dedicated his life to expository preaching, being interviewed. This is for the Master's Seminary, I believe, and this was all off the cuff from Steve Lawson being asked questions about expository preaching. And what you're going to hear him present, I do not believe is embraced by those who plagiarize. It can't be. They can't understand that they are actually speaking on behalf of God to his people, and they will be judged more so than the rest of us for their teaching. And it could be a very bad day for these preachers who mishandle the word of God. That should cause the preacher to get into the pulpit with fear and trembling, having spent himself at least all week preparing for the most important moment of the church week.
The pulpit, the preaching of the word of God to the congregation, is really of the single most greatest importance in the life of the church. And the reason for that is it's the preaching of the word of God that defines and directs everything else in the church. For example, you mentioned music and worship. We cannot worship God until we know who he is. And it's really our theology that produces doxology. And so the preacher, in reality, is the primary worship leader in the church because of the primacy of the preaching of the Word of God.
The primacy of the preaching of the Word of God. Thousands of men would say, yeah, I do that. I just get some ideas off the internet, and I use my credit card to purchase them, but it doesn't matter because this is how you grow your brand. This is how you build a church. A fellow named Mike Turner writing an article, pastors should stop buying sermons online. He has a quote from a megachurch pastor who stated, the secret to a growing church is, how would you fill in that blank? He filled it in with one word repeated 3 times. Here it is. The secret to a growing church is steal, steal, steal. Well, that's one way to get people to come, tickle their ears by delivering a sermon that you apparently do not have an ability to write, which is precisely the problem here. There are those who would say, I'm too busy. In this particular article, and I echo the sentiment because, well, I want to give him credit so that I'm not guilty of the same thing that's going on right now. You're busy doing the wrong things. The Sunday sermon is it, sir. It charts the course of the church week. Some pastors would say, well, some people are so gifted at it, why not utilize it? I'll tell you why. Because you're supposed to be gifted at it. And if you're not, you shouldn't be in a pulpit. If you can't put together a biblically sound sermon, it doesn't need to be Spurgeon-esque. It just needs to be biblical and sound and delivered by a man who has spent hours and hours and hours actually basting in the text. Then if you can't do that, you got the wrong job. And it's time to find a career elsewhere. Motivational speaking is big these days. I might point you in that direction. But if you're a pastor who thinks you're too busy to prepare a sermon, or you think that you don't have the skills for it, then, sir, you're simply not qualified to be a preacher. And integrity would encourage you to admit that to your congregation and step down. This is Wretched Radio. Hey, I'm Todd. I'm going to be your Uber driver. What's your destination?
2054 Kemple Lane.
No. Your eternal destination. The liberals, they brought in Pelagianism. It's the old Sabellian heresy, denying the Trinitarian Godhead. 3 persons, 1 God, not to the Sabellians. No. They would say that it's actually just 1 God. Please, somebody!